cosmic storm. Floating on whimsical wavelengths is the norm. Dancing through the stars, chasing spectrums of light. Riding the waves that are just out of sight.
It's time for a new episode of Whimsical Wavelengths. New episode, new topic. Yeah, I know. I told you that today was going to be part 2, and it is. Today's field site, though, is in the same area. It's practically the same as our previous episode, but the topics are vastly different. So, last episode, 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Glyn Williams-Jones on the podcast talking about Mount Meager, which is a Cascadian volcano, which sits about 160 kilometers northwest of where I'm recording this intro right now in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. The Cascades do not end at the border between the US and Canada. So, Mount Meager is part of the same volcanic chain as Mount St. Helens, Rainier, Mount Baker, and all the rest of the famous volcanoes that go right through the western United States of America. Mount Meager last erupted about 2,400 years ago, and today the mountain is quite literally in danger of falling apart. The largest landslide in Canadian history took place here in 2010, briefly damming the Lillooet River. I don't want anyone skipping the last episode. But that really is the bare minimum context from the last one that you need going into this one. Because today we shift focus. Instead of volcanic behavior, we're talking about what can actually be done to reduce risk and make communities downstream of Mount Meager safer. Studying hazards isn't just about watching something happen and taking notes and, just taking observations. It's about understanding the systems well enough that we can change outcomes. Sometimes that means changing behavior. Sometimes it means engineering controls. So let's just give a couple examples, really simple ones like icy roads. If I know the road is slippery, when I'm driving down it, I'm going to slow down. i.e., this is a behavioral change. So I'm making a change to my behavior because I know of the hazard or risk in front of me. On a busy highway, you often also see concrete dividers to keep lanes separate from opposite directions of traffic. This is because if someone loses control and crosses the dividing line, it's bad news. So this is an example of an engineered solution reducing risk. But when the hazard isn't immediately visible or understandable because it's freezing outside, like a future flood or a landslide that might happen, things get a lot more complicated and nuanced. Now you need data, you need models, you need people who can translate that risk into something meaningful. And you need communication, and not just between scientists, but between communities, institutions, and decision makers. You need coalitions that can agree not only that a problem exists, but that it's worth investing in solutions before something goes really wrong. That process is also how resilience gets built. Well-connected communities respond better to hazards. They recover faster. They make clearer decisions under pressure. And that doesn't happen by accident. It's engineered just as much as a reinforced slope or the concrete barriers dividing a highway. So in this episode, we're moving downstream, literally and figuratively, from identifying hazards to communicating them, from raw data to public understanding, from here's the risk to here's what we can do about it. So let's talk about rivers, risks, and how solutions can keep small problems from rock sliding downstream, or in this case, causing more hazards in the future. Please welcome to Whimsical Wavelength someone who's a fellow graduate from UVic, University of Victoria, an environmental professional with a master's looking at hazards and resilience from Royal Roads University, an author, and someone passionate about investing in communities to reduce risk and making a good environmental impact. Please welcome Veronica Woodruff.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
Before we get towards the problems and solutions, I always like to touch on career paths first. And there's so many different ways to interact with science in the real world through data, instead of just being in a lab somewhere or inside of academia. So remember, listeners, we've also covered food science and plastics and other industrial, like my own cell phone, geophysics. Your LinkedIn says environmental professional. Is that like a professional designation, like a P.Eng, or in my case, a P.Geo?
No, it's not. And I actually put a lot of thought into that wording around environmental professional, because what does that really mean? And so with my background, I started in with a technical diploma for fish wildlife, and then started working with local government very early in my career as a 20-year-old. And I was in Whistler, so a wonderful place to kick off your career at a time when the municipality was growing quickly in the mid 90s. So there was a lot of opportunity to work with a whole wide range of professionals. For that decade, I'd worked for local government. So with that came multiple certifications different designations. I was a trainer for wetland keepers, a lot of volunteer organizations through DFO and supporting hatchery operations and salmon restoration, and then I was at UVic for restoration of natural systems. And because I focused so much on restoration in the early part of my career, because again, with Whistler and its development, there was so much impact on riparian and different waterways, development of new golf courses and new subdivisions. And so really understanding construction impacts, development impacts, what policy relates to those things. And then I moved into construction monitoring with my own company in Pemberton, and working mostly with our Pemberton Valley Diking district, who is in charge of flood risk, and getting to know the intricacies of provincial and federal regulatory systems. And then
It's okay. We're here for all of it. Get nerdy.
Okay. Yeah, and then from that transition to a decade as a project manager with Ecofish Research, a consulting company specializing in microhydro, where I was fortunate enough to tromp around incredible ecosystems all around the province, and looking at the ecosystem, so wetlands or grizzly bear habitat, old growth, but also incredible species like wolverine and mountain goats, and of course Pacific salmon, where my career has been rooted for most of the 30 years. And and then I started my own business in 2019 doing grant writing, which so when I sold the business last year, we had written about $200 million worth of grants in all kinds of sectors. So environmental professional sort of encapsulates all of those things. So I'm not a registered professional biologist, so I don't have a designation, but it's this 30 years of experience that has led me to those two words.
I see. Well, I guess I got two questions, and I'll go back to the beginning, and then we'll go jump ahead to the grant writing. So you mentioned being able to kind of get a lot of experience while being in Whistler. For those listening, nearby is the Britannia mine. It's a huge example of acid rock drainage and environmental impacts. Was used at any point as like, that's why I'm doing this, or?
Well, a little bit, yeah. I mean, I guess early on in my career, in the fish wildlife diploma, at the time, I just assumed that we knew everything about everything. Like all of my instructors were these people. They were going to impart their knowledge on us around fish or trees or whatever the case may be. And it took me a little while of maturing to realize how little we know. And it was actually Richard Hebda at UVic, who is teaching an ecology course, who said, it's really the brilliant man that says, we don't know anything. And that is really where we're at today, is that we have such limited knowledge of these intricacies of these systems. So yeah, and then things like Britannia, that was interesting too, like the public-private partnership to develop these systems to right a historical wrong that nobody was technically responsible for cleaning up. And so, yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about that further on in our conversation.
Absolutely. Just to touch on grant writing, because that is one part, like every once in a while throughout Whimsical Wavelengths, it's a bit of the sausage making of how science gets made. And one of that I don't know very well, maybe because I never got to be a professor chasing grants, is the whole funding side of things. Like, what goes into actually trying to get something funded?
Yeah, it's tricky. And there's so many ways to fund projects, but often, when you're looking at a really complex project like ecosystem restoration, let's say you're going to do a salmon habitat project. But then, and it used to be simpler in the 90s and 2000s. You could have this idea, you could test it out, you could get a grant for $20,000 for your excavator, your permitting would take 45 days, and you could just go ahead. Now it's a lot more complex. So if you've got to do a lot more upfront work around, say, groundwater assessments, hydrological assessments. You have to understand how you're going to integrate into downstream flood risk or infrastructure risk, and all valid things. And permitting can take up to 2 years. You need professional designations to stamp your ideas. And so it becomes a lot more expensive. So that $20,000 project that you could do in 1998 now costs $200,000 to do and takes multiple years. And so with funding, it all depends. You just really want to meet the funders' goals of the program. And sometimes it's really challenging to figure out where your ideas dovetail into somebody that has money that wants to fund that idea. And that requires partnerships often, so that you can build a project that perfectly aligns with any funder's desired outcomes.
I guess that by necessity kind of forces you to be a good communicator, being able to bring the data and the science together for those to make that dovetailing work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that, again, that's like a career length experience where I look at things I wrote in the, 2000s where I was trying to be overly complicated and make things sound a certain way that I thought would equate to professionalism. And in reality, telling the story clearly with plain language that can resonate with multiple audiences is a better way to go.
And just because that's where this is a great point to kind of latch on to the rest of the episode, because I thought we'd concentrate on the Lillooet River and the tributary drainages that are from Mount Meager, which is just kind of north of Pemberton. And I'm going to be leaning on a lot of the information that you gave in a talk with Dr. Glenn Williams-Jones, whose episode comes out just before this one, about in Whistler, talking about these topics. In actual fact, if you want to listen to the talk, listeners, and see it, it's in the show notes. It's a YouTube link. And by all means, as I already mentioned, feel free to get technical, talk nerdy to us, set the stage. Humans are known for modifying their surroundings. So let's go back into the past and set this all up from the beginning. What kind of things did we understand in the past in the reference of Mount Meager and its drainages? And then what did we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a great place to start because often, even in modern times, standing on the edge of a seemingly pristine river in a forest, there's so many assumptions you make innately about what that ecosystem is rather than what it was. And Pemberton's a great example of that. So we're about 50 kilometers downstream from Mount Meager, connected by the Lillooet River, fairly large river. And it's in the grand context, the Lillooet flows into the Harrison, flows into the Fraser River. So we have this connection to the Fraser River. We have really important salmon that migrate here to spawn that are genetically unique to the Fraser. And we're really important for Fraser River species because although we're the smallest land-based watershed, we contribute the second highest flow of all the other watersheds of the Fraser. So really important because we have glaciers. So that cold water coming into Mission in the spring, really important for salmon that are migrating north throughout the whole Fraser River watershed. So this region, that glaciated mountainous, the nature of the ecosystems here are really important in a provincial context. And so Pemberton is a small agricultural valley within Lillooet Nation traditional territory. So Lillooet have been here for many, many thousands of years now. They're doing some interesting studies on quantifying what that is and looking up to like the 5,000-6,000 year history in the valley. And I don't know if Glenn mentioned this, but there was some new research that he had done around some just traditional stories that related to the last eruption of Mount Meager, which was 2,400 years ago. And as you would know, that's like yesterday in geological history.
It
So
sure is.
yeah, so that's a fairly recent eruption in geological timescales. And since about 1900, I mean, people were starting to settle here as part of the Gold Rush Trail. It's a really beautiful, fertile valley, and but would get flooded out quite often. And so there was a large flood in 1940. And the federal government at the time, through the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, said, hey, we've got to do some bigger investments. And they did investments all across the country for drought mitigation and flood mitigation. And in Pemberton, this was a huge investment. They built almost 40 kilometers of dikes and straightened, 14 kilometers of the river. So they basically pushed the big rivers to either side of the valley, and the material that they were digging out of the river to straighten it, they just used as a berm, and they built it right along the banks of the river for most of the way. We've since learned when you wanted to do that effectively, you've got to let the river have some space to be able to do what it's going to do, to allow those natural processes to occur. That's not what happened in that 40 kilometers of dikes here. The berms were really built right up against the river to allow for the most amount of farmland.
So
Yeah.
was that strictly as a decision for farmland, or is this something we learned another place and learned it wrongly?
I just think it was probably the thinking of the time, and the regulatory like ecosystem at the time wouldn't have been the same type of oversight that you
For
would see
sure, but I was
today.
just wondering about the flood reduction type part of it. Like, is that something they did in Europe and then we just kind of applied it here? Or was it a bit of the Wild West and we just thought this might work, so we did it? Like,
Yeah,
just kind of
and I
curious.
think that's exactly. I think it's Wild West, and that's actually. I don't actually know. Say, I haven't looked up the flood protection literature from the 40s, but that actually would be really interesting, because one of the other things they did, this massive, like people would have this vision. The amount of work it takes to straighten the river and build these berms is enormous. And the other
Yeah.
thing that they would have done is they blasted out the narrows of Lillooet Lake. So they took out almost, it was 473,000 cubic meters of material out of Lillooet Lake. So they blasted out the narrows to lower the lake. And they lowered the whole entirety of Lillooet Lake by 2 to 3 meters. So this is like an enormous volume of water. And this created the delta that comes out of the Lillooet River into the lake was the fastest growing delta in North America for several decades because of that disruption of lowering the lake by so much and the amount of sediment coming down. So yeah, like a real, I, I don't know. Surely there was some engineer on site giving some direction because these were big ideas with huge machinery. But thinking about it from an ecological perspective, I don't think that was part of the thought process back then.
Wow. Okay, so just kind of reiterating the scene, we have a river, it's been straightened, it's got glaciers nearby, so various levels of snowpack from year to year, which means in spring, sometimes it's floods. That is more or less what was planned for, or at least that was the idea, as we already mentioned in the last episode in the intro. What happened in 2010?
Okay, so 2010, we have this massive landslide off of Mount Meager. And I know you just talked to Glenn, but Mount Meager, I envision it like this mountain made of like a king's crown. So there's all of these series of peaks around the mountain that have been eroded based on glaciation and other erosion processes. And Capricorn Creek is one of those peaks in the King Crown. And in August 2010, it's super hot in the Alpines. So the glaciers are melting and it destabilizes an entire mountain peak. And that peak disintegrates and then roars down the valley and deposits about 50 million cubic meters into the valley. So the Pemberton Valley up in Meager. So this is right at the confluence of Meager Creek and the Lillooet River. And the whole landslide scar is about 2,400 acres. So it's a really big area of what this peak has taken from the top to the bottom. And it's really cool because there was eyewitness accounts. There was the province had moved a campground from the base of the mountain over across the river, thinking like, okay, we'll put this campground here just in case landslides. Like there had been several landslides over the previous 2 decades along that drainage, not anywhere near this size, but significant landslides that had taken out bridges and other things. And they said, okay, we'll move the campground. So there's these guys at the campground. They show up like 15 minutes before the landslide happens. So they're just unpacking. It's 3:20 in the morning. They're getting all their gear out of the car and they
3:20 in the morning?
Yeah, like AM. Yeah.
Wow.
3:25. I don't know what they were doing. There's probably a story there too. But they hear these two massive cracks, and then it's for 5 minutes. It's so loud they can't even. It sounds, by their count, it sounded like a massive forest fire or a train. And they just grab. It's a bunch of guys and their dog, and they jump in the truck and they try to drive back the way they had come, and it's just a wall of mud and trees. And so they turn around, drive back the other way, and they basically drove through this other leading edge of the landslide coming off of around the campsite, and they made it through just barely. They talk about it being like the Millennium Falcon escape from the Death Star. It was really neat to have an eyewitness account to that.
Especially when it ended up being a good type of eyewitness account. They made it out.
Exactly. There was another group that got helied out. They had been hiking up at Thousand Lakes, and they were coming back down towards the landslide, and a helicopter landed and was like, "Are you guys okay?" And they had no idea what was happening, but they wouldn't have been able to get anywhere because the road was completely gone, not just washed out, but just gone. So.
Yeah, I've been to one of the campgrounds. It's closed, but it was right on the edge. It wasn't quite inundated. I don't know which one that is in reference to this, but that
is the one. Yeah,
it's quite inspiring when you just get out to the edge of that campground and you just look almost as far as you can see, unless you're looking up the mountain. It's just covered with debris, essentially.
I love going out there. Like if there's any way to feel small in a landscape, that is the place to stand at the toe of that landslide, because it is incredible. That process in action.
Absolutely. So I guess to think about this in my own brain, we talk about all this sediment coming down, essentially broken up rock as it collapsed and flowed down the valley. I think about this in my past courses. First, like excess sediment first just brings up to the mind braided streams or rivers. For the listeners, you can think of braided hair, different channels kind of meandering and splitting apart instead of having a single river channel, where there's just too much sediment available that can be carried easily. It's a dynamic environment with yearly changes of sand and rock depositing in different spots as some channels fill up with sediment and get abandoned, or new channels erode faster, robbing the flow of others. Is that the new environment that we have, and did that exist before the landslide?
Yeah. So when you think about like river processes, you have a river likes to meander in this natural deposition and scour. So, you'll have some high flows and this beautiful river makes a sinew through the landscape. So you picture like looking an overhead view of, say, an Alaskan river, and you can see it meandering side to side in the river valley. So yes, those processes occurred, and in some years you'd get a flood, or you'd get some higher flows and increased deposition, increased erosion, and you'd have things like oxbow lakes where you have some of those meanders cut off, and you have all these sort of like river evolution, a natural river evolution of what happens. And when you put so much sediment into it, that kicks that evolution, that river evolution, out of whack. So the river isn't able to follow those natural processes of deposition and scour, because all of they're getting is deposition. It's just too much material. And now when you drive up the river, and you can look at the aerial photos over time, there's several really amazing reports on this, is how much deposition there has been. So millions of cubic meters of sediment have now been eroded off the toe of that slide, where that slide occurred, and has been mobilized downstream. So when you look and say the 30 kilometers downstream of the landslide, that river has changed completely. There are sections that are just wall to wall sediment where you used to have more natural sections where you have, midstream islands, forested islands, you have side channels, you have sort of that natural river ecology versus now this river that's out of whack. And then that gets compounded once you get into the diked reach. So when you get into
the area that was all straightened previously, right?
That's right. Yeah. So suddenly the upper valley, so the upper 30 kilometers, the river isn't confined. So what's happened is there's so much deposition, the river's moving side to side. There's massive piles of sediment everywhere as far as the eye can see. Then suddenly you get into the diked reach where there isn't enough space for the river to do that. So that sediment, the river is moving faster like a flume, and that what we're seeing is aggradation. So the riverbed is filling in. And when the riverbed fills in, the river water level goes up, and that makes the diking less efficient. So with, those dikes initially built in the 40s, and over time, there's been some big floods. So 84 was a really big flood. There was dike overtopped everywhere in Pemberton. It was a massively destructive flood. 1991, another big flood, and our largest flood in record in 2003. So after each of these events, the diking was upgraded. And so we've seen several floods since the 2010 landslide, 2015, 2016, 2021, 2022, 2024, 25. We've seen these high flows. We haven't got anywhere near the 2003 flow, our largest flood on record, but we're seeing, because of the aggradation, because of the effectiveness of the diking is reduced now because there's more sediment, we're seeing more widespread evacuation alerts and orders depending on the flow. So in 2016, for example, that was the largest flood we've had since 2010, since the slide in 2010, and that caused quite a bit of overland flooding at several properties and evacuation orders throughout the valley. So yeah, what in summary of all that is that our flood risk is increasing because of all the deposition. So as the river bottom fills up, we are just more at risk of flooding in Pemberton.
One quick question, just to go back to something you said originally. How does now the delta into the lake build speed comparing to what it was when they first dug it all out and created that problem to begin with?
Yeah, well, one thing that's happening is the river's starting to widen. So we're losing riparian forests. Where there is no diking, you can see the widening of the river happening very quickly because of that deposition. And at the lake outlet, there is it's actually really amazing. There's so much deposition there at the lake outlet that it's really, really wide from valley, within the valley between the mountains there. And that channel is changing quite a bit. There's just a lot of movement of the river going through there, and it's all of the previous side channels that have been wetted in the past have been activated in the last few years with our higher flows. And we've been really lucky. Like in 2021, the floods that happened throughout the lower mainland, or even this past floods that are still ongoing in the Fraser Valley, those systems have missed Pemberton. So we've been really lucky with the amount of rainfall that we've basically dodged the bullet several times since 2016.
Okay, so while this problem has nearly arrived instantaneously in 2010, I'm hoping that there are some solutions or something we can do to reduce the future hazards, right?
Yes. So I've been speaking a lot in terms of humans because it's really our flood risk that's increasing, and this makes for an interesting conversation to engage with people. But it's also been some big impacts on fish and wildlife populations, certainly on site at the slide, because it's been slow to revegetate based on the mineral nature, also the periodic flooding, the distributed nature of the channels there in the slide debris. And so what can we do about this? It's the one thing we cannot do is build dikes bigger, because they were built along the river to start. We don't have the land base to be able to make them larger. And not only that, it's incredibly expensive now to increase dikes height because the regulations have changed. So, for example, a newer regulation that affects Pemberton is the seismic regulation. So, we now are governed with a seismic risk where you've got to build your dikes to withstand a seismic event to a certain degree. And our risk, although is less than Richmond, let's say, the Lower Mainland, much less, we are still required to build to that standard or justify why we don't have to build to that standard, which is also very expensive. And so that would mean, we just, again, don't have the land base or the funding to be able to build to that standard, where dikes previously, 20 years ago, you're looking at about $500,000 per kilometer. The estimates now range from 2 to 10 million per kilometer for a dike build.
Whoa, that's way faster than inflation.
Yeah, and it's hard to justify. I mean, Pemberton real estate's gone crazy here since about 2018, 2019, and through the pandemic, as most places have seen, but we don't have the population base that, say, Richmond has. So justifying an investment at that scale is pretty challenging when you're looking at a population base of about 7,500 for the entire region versus, that would be a block in a, more urban setting. So yeah, so now we have to think of creative solutions. So what can we do that doesn't cost as much money? And, there's several different kinds of options we've been looking at. And when you think about disaster management, there's the 4 pillars of emergency management. So there's preparedness, so becoming prepared for the risks. There's the mitigation, so like the structural mitigation we're talking about with diking or blowing out the narrows. There's the response, and then there's recovery. So in the preparedness phase, to become prepared, we have a local government. We've got a Village Pemberton, we've got the regional district, we've got Lillooet Nation, and then we have the Pemberton Valley Diking District. They are an improvement district, and they're a really important governing agency because their only job is to manage flood risk. And they have, as an improvement district, they've been deemed this power to allow to collect taxes for that purpose. And so we've been incredibly lucky that they are in charge of that, because you can imagine especially local governments like the Squamish Lillooet Regional District, they deal with every hazard BC has to offer. So having someone in Pemberton that's dedicated to the risk of flooding, because it's our highest risk, is really important. And they have increased the monitoring network in the most incredible way. So whereas 10 years ago, we had a single data point to assess flood risk, so our Water Survey of Canada gauge on the Lillooet River, they've now installed pretty much visibility for every major drainage in the watershed. And along that, with meteorological data, so seeing rainfall and freezing levels, snow water equivalents, where you can really predict. You can see if a raindrop falls at Mount Meager, it's going to take about 6 hours to roll down that mountain and make it into town. So if it's raining 10 millimeters an hour out there, and it's only raining 2 mils in town, something's coming. You can actually gauge how much the river's going to go up. And similarly, if you see, so Green River comes from the Whistler watershed. If the Green River, Whistler, and Rutherford are getting a ton of water, we know how much the green affects locally versus the Birkenhead or some other of the inputs. So it's a really interesting way. It's an interesting dashboard you have when you have predicted flood risks. We went through this last week. We had a high level prediction of the river going up towards maybe 1,100 cubic meters per second. That's a fairly big flood. That would have been almost the biggest one we've had since 2003. And we only got to 300. So that discrepancy between what's predicted and what shows up, having the real-time dashboard to make decisions around emergency management has become really important.
Yeah, I can imagine. You can get timely evacuation notices. You can protect people and property, animals, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly.
Must also be able to use that as a good communication tool as well, right? Like nothing
Exactly.
nothing really tells a story of what the threat is than sometimes the data.
Yeah. And the Diking district, again, because they're autonomous, they have some flexibility on how they communicate to public. So they can say, hey, here's this level of uncertainty we have, which is sometimes challenging for governments to say.
I
You
can
know,
imagine also that because it's not a government, or I should say, not directly connected to those who have to get reelected, that gives them a lot more longevity to be able to stick with this for a lot longer, right?
exactly. And when you tie something like emergency management to a political cycle, uh, that you make challenging decisions. And similarly, emergency managers, like there's not a lot of other jobs or sectors where you have the pressure to make decisions on people's lives. You know,
Both
like,
short term and long term, because sometimes you're making them
yeah,
like that, and sometimes you're like, oh, I got to look 20 years out. So the
yeah, and
scale
so
difference.
absolutely, and so I appreciate why an emergency manager for a local government is going to be cautious in the messaging, right? You don't want to be, you lose trust if you say, everybody evacuate and nothing happens. And you lose trust if you say nothing and everybody floods. And so that's a fine balance professionally to manage. And I have great appreciation for the people that work in that sector. And so with the Diking District, they're really, really data heavy, and they have a really great way of using plain language to communicate that to the community, saying, this is the decisions we're making. There were evacuation alerts issued. And the key part of that was the why. This is why we're doing that. Versus when you're in the response phase, you're just telling people to go now. You know, if there's an evacuation required, you're not telling them why. And some people really need the why in order to build trust and make the decision.
Okay, changing gears a little bit and circling back to something I know you mentioned, and I know the reasons why you mentioned it, but let's flush that out a little bit more. You mentioned that there's no very little vegetation on these slopes now, and that's potentially part of the reason why all of this sediment is now free to flow downhill,
Yeah.
right? So, are there things that can be done in that regard? You mentioned something about planting trees. I don't know if we've actually
Yeah.
mentioned yet, or as I'm reading it and I'm inserting it here. But I think you also are involved with changing the flow of the river upstream to lock the sediment in place. Perhaps now would be a good time to kind of have that discussion. Like, what are the processes there? Like, what are we trying to do up there to lock that sediment in place?
Yeah. Perfect. That's so we've just talked about preparedness, and now let's talk about mitigation. What can we actually do to make this better? And so the first thing that we've done in 2019, so again, coming back to my career, just worked a lot in ecosystem restoration. And I was on site prior to the landslide. We were doing with the hydropower project up there. So we were doing a bunch of assessments, and then the landslide occurred. And it was just looking at that huge scar on the landscape where you've just lost these forests and all this habitat, and just thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have broadcast seed alder or some early successional species that could have just gained root and all of that mobile debris. And it turns out alder seed, while a pound has zillion seeds in it, it's very expensive. So
Oh
yeah,
no.
yeah. So that's we're back pocket that. And I was chatting with a friend, Troy Bacady, who's the emergency manager for Lillooet Nation, and in 2019, and we were talking about landslide revegetation because the landslide had come down almost a decade before. Not a lot of trees had regrown. And yes, successional processes will take place over time, but there are barriers to that happening, including extraordinarily hot summers. We in Pemberton got to 44.1 degrees in the heat dome. It's very, very hot and dry. And
What year was that again?
22. Heat dome was 22.
Yeah, that must be right. I was
21 or
in
22. Yeah.
Saskatchewan in the swamps at the time.
Yeah. I feel like it might be 21 because it was heat dome anyways, it's 21 or 22. That's funny that I don't know that off the top of my head. But um, that's
It
this is a
created a
bite you gotta.
barrier for the vegetation to be able to regrow, right? Because you were aimed up, I would imagine a lot of the seeds would just fail to germinate underneath that heat.
Yeah. The other thing that happened up there in 2015, we had the largest fire, second largest fire that ever occurred in the Coast Mountains. So, this is going to sound silly now to anyone that's in the interior, but in 2015, we had two fires. One was right on Meager, and one was in the Upper Eelaho. They came within a kilometer of connecting, and that fire was 8,000 hectares, and the Eelaho fire was 22,000 hectares. And so when you talk about fires at that scale, now that we've had a couple of seasons of 1 million to 2 million hectare fires, it means nothing. But at the time, we hadn't hit that million mark. And a fire of that size in the coast was unheard of. So it was a really important shift in how fires occur on the coast. So there wasn't a lot of recruitment available because 2 of the 3 slopes that border the landslide are now burnt. So there's no nursery trees to be filling in the landscape there. So successionally, we've got the fire, we've got the mineral soil from basically the entire mountain peak that's now on the valley bottom, and we've got these changes to our summer heat. And so, but there were some areas that were revegetating. We had mountain avens, like a really low growing shrub. We had some slide alder that had been revegetating. But looking at that, we said, okay, well, where could we focus growing some conifers? And with Lillooet Nation and Lillooet Forestry Ventures, collected seed for red alder, cottonwood, birch, and we've since planted about 380,000 trees on the landslide deposition. And we've started now focusing first on areas where we knew we could find survival as a bit of a test case to see what would survive because of the conditions. And the very first plant we planted about 30,000 trees. And it was at the end, it was 2023, and we were at the end of a drought cycle. It was incredibly dry. And the trees got in a car accident on the Sea to Sky Highway, and we were just late getting them in the way the planters were ready. So we ended up planting on June 1st. This felt both exciting and just terrible for timing. And we got them in the ground. You can't access the site during the summer because of landslide risk. As soon as it gets warm in the Alpine, the area is shut down. So we left them to grow all summer. And we were hoping for maybe 20% survival, and we thought that would be good enough. And we got back, and we've probably seen 80% survival. It's almost like magic volcanic dirt that came down from the top of the mountain.
It's a common theme around volcanoes, actually. That's why people do so much farming next to them, right?
Absolutely. Like lessons from Iceland. And so we've been really lucky. We've done 3 big sites where we've started to replant trees, and we are working up to getting closer and closer to where we can plant to actually start to stabilize slopes that are more susceptible to erosion. So that's one of our mitigation options. And that's really exciting. I mean, it's important for sediment erosion, but it's also important for habitat. So that was another driver of that project. It wasn't solely just for downstream sediment management, but also for increased habitat for wildlife. And with that, we did also plant berry-producing shrubs, so salmonberry and thimbleberry. That is really lacking in that landslide area, but is in adjacent habitats. So the big, exciting option is engineered log jams.
Right.
So engineered log jams is a technique that's been used extensively in Washington. One of the leaders in this technique, Tim Abbey, and Natural Systems Design, they have done projects all throughout Washington, really throughout the world, but working on similar systems to Mount Meager, high sediment loads in the Cascade volcanic range, really, really similar contexts, really successfully. And the key to an engineered logjam, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's building a logjam. And if you envision what a logjam looks like naturally in a river, is just sort of a mess of pickup sticks all piled up in the corner. When you construct one of those, you have to make it fairly stable. So you're using massive pilings, trees as pilings, and preloading the front of them. And then as the river does its magic, it just grows over time. And each of these engineered log jams are so interesting because they lock in sediment behind them. So they can capture up to 1,500 cubic meters of sediment behind each one of these jams. And that captured sediment eventually gets the seeds, it starts to grow trees, and it becomes part of the habitat. And each of those log jams, they create these hydrological effects in the river where you have deeper pools, you have areas. That idea of scour and deposition happens on this smaller scale around a single engineered log jam. So you get your deep pools for your fry, you get your deposition of gravel for spawning. And these are things that are really being impacted by the volume of sediment coming into the river. And the trick to engineered log jams is you can't build just one. You have to build a series of engineered log jams. And so we had natural systems design. We had funding through the province and the regional district and the Diking district and the village of Pemberton. And we looked at, we had natural systems design come up because of their expertise in working in these systems to develop a concept plan for what that would look like for the Lillooet River and the sediment from Mount Meager. And they've developed a concept reach that includes about 92 engineered log jams. Now, here's the kicker. Yeah, it's a lot.
But you figure it, 92 times, let's just round up to 100 to make our life easier. You said it was 1,500 cubic meters of sediment. So now you're timesing that by 100, just ballparking. Like that's got to be pretty close to, is that like getting close to what is coming down in an annual way?
Yeah. So prior to the landslide, all of our floodplain mapping estimated around 30 to 40,000 cubic meters moving down into the river. Because we're in the mountains, we have lots of landslides that happen all the time, not at the scale that the Capricorn slide was. But so that was our kind of base estimated loading, 30 to 40,000. After the landslide, the estimate's 180 to 210,000 cubic meters annual deposition in the river.
So this particular suggestion would more than half of potential the amount of sediment.
Yeah. And not only that, the concept reach over a couple of kilometers at this kind of, I mean, it's not narrow, but narrow in the landscape, could create this buffered approach to further deposition coming through the treatment reach into downstream. And to me, it's really, really exciting. It is exactly what green infrastructure means when you look at that as a priority, because the habitat benefits for building something like this are incredible, but also for managing sediment tied to the habitat benefits is just win-win. Because one of the things in our updated floodplain mapping that occurred in 2018, one of the recommendations was to take 100,000 cubic meters out of a sediment basin in that reach where this ELJ, the engineered logjam concept is. Now, you imagine removing 100,000 cubic meters of sediment every year. You're just digging up the river, and that's just from the upstream reach. They also recommended doing 60,000 through the populated reach of town, which they are doing currently. Yeah, it's a mountain to manage. So 60,000 cubic meters are being removed annually in the downstream reach already. That's done by bar scalping in the winter. So glacial system gets cold, the snow tightens up and the rivers drop and the gravel bars are exposed, and you just excavate the top of the bars. This is done on the Fraser as well. There's a lot of research around habitat impacts to this style of sediment removal. It's really effective with limited effects. You can imagine doing this in the water with dredging. There's going to be a lot more habitat effects that occur. So yeah, this engineered logjam is an alternative to that upstream 100,000 cubic meter sediment. Because where do you even put that much sediment? You're going to build yourself your own mountain.
Sure, I suspect the upfront cost of the log jams is going to be more than the upfront cost of slowly removing 100,000 by year by year by year. But long term, do they start to even out? Just sheerly cost. We're not talking about the increases to fishing and human ability to enjoy. We're going to leave those intangibles out for just a moment. But like cost-wise, what are we talking about?
The return on investment is tricky, straight dollar to dollar. So right now, the Diking district currently spends about 500,000 to 750,000 a year to remove 60,000 cubic meters of sediment. These, if we look at the short-term cost, it's about $1.7 to $2 million for the engineered logjam to store that much sediment.
That's it?
So, yeah.
I was expecting it to be way worse than that.
The tricky part is the concept reach to build ranges from we basically need 10 to $20 million to build the concept.
Right. But 20 years and you've got $12 million in just removal of the lower part. We're not even talking about the 100,000 of the upper part yet.
Yeah.
Like the 100,000 cubic meters.
The engineered log jams are be constructed in the upper part. Yeah, to me, this is all worth it. It's just the upfront cost to construct it, because each of those engineered log jams costs between about $100,000 to $225,000 Canadian. That includes all the engineering, that's the permitting, and all the materials and the excavation. So they're really expensive. So when you have this series of 92, it just is a really big undertaking to get that all constructed. And so a project in the $20 million scale range, we don't fund things at that scale here in Canada. The last job that Natural Systems Design did in Washington was $200 million US. They did that with the Army Corps of Engineers. That is just not something we do at a scale in Canada at this time.
I still find that so surprising, considering what's the cost to put in the high-speed rail between Ottawa and Montreal, and it's supposed to be like $10 billion.
Yeah,
and that just came in. Or
yeah.
Site C. Like we do fund these sorts of things in Canada. We just don't fund this with this aim, I guess, is the way to say it. And it surprises me because this has got to be cheaper in the long run, I would think.
It's really hard to justify spending proactively. We are reactive spenders. So the flood happens, how can we fix what just happened? It's really, we just generally don't fund things in the same way proactively.
Okay, so that seems to be the most obvious solution at this time to try to stabilize the environment as well as rehabilitate it. So what's the process for advocating for this solution on your end?
I'm living it right now with you. I'm just getting the word out. Before I came to talk to you, I just, for fun, I just went onto the NASDAQ to look at the December 2025 priced initial public offerings. So there's $11.5 billion of priced investment there for December alone on the NASDAQ, where people are chasing this next unicorn in tech and AI. And we need to find that same kind of passion for investing in things that don't have monetary value necessarily, but have this intrinsic value to our lives. This is especially important at this time we're living through because, we've just watching what happened with the floods in Washington or California today, or North Carolina in the hurricane season last year. Like we are starting to see the impacts of a changing climate and what that might look like. And everything that we can do to be investing in habitat, because again, the intricacies of interconnectedness is not visible to us as humans. And so all of those protections are important at every level. And the more we can invest in those pieces of the environment, it's better for our kids' kids. That's my pitch.
Yeah. There's really no other better way to make us more resilient. And in this case, it is about the hazard mitigation. It's more than just hug a tree. It's so much more than that.
Yeah. And these are our systems that keep us alive as a species, and they're important to invest in, because even just you could pick one component of that, and like the salmon, let's say, and tie all of the little pieces of the Pacific salmon life cycle to both human and other ecosystem resilience, and recognize the value of investing in that. It is there. It's not just an intrinsic value. This is something that is necessary.
For sure. It seems like a really good spot here to also allow you to, because we're approaching the infamous last question, your favorite science joke. But before we do, I think this is like the perfect spot. Like anything you want to call out more along the same lines. I got told that via the interwebs that you've also published a book recently. This is like the chance to either go on a rant, although I have a feeling I just interrupted your rant, or whatever else that you want to call out here as we head towards the end of the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Yes, I did just publish a book. That was a really fun, deep exploration. And most people I know is like, oh, you published a book on nature. And I was like, no, it's actually about booze. So taking that, just the way I live my life of kind of like deep curiosity, I did that in a review of alcohol in society. And it's tied to memoir because I grew up with this ridiculous way that I always thought might be story worthy, and worked with a small publisher in Vancouver and was able to tie kind of my parents, as my dad was a professional corporate lawyer, and how alcohol affected his life versus coming into Whistler and alcohol in professional sport and biological conferences and all the rest, and how that infuses to different layers of society and what the research says about it. And who knew there was so much research about drunk doctors or drunk lawyers or drunk firefighters?
But the
research, yeah, well, not on the job, but as often as a coping mechanism.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, it was just a fun, so I live really happily in research in this environmental world, but it was actually really fun to go into this other, physiological world of research, and then, of course, behavioral. So that's that book. It's called Blind Drunk, a sober look at our boozy culture.
And for those who are not nearby us, where could they get it if they wanted it?
It's available everywhere in North America at bookstores. It's available to order throughout the U.S., but in Canada, it's available at bookstores all across the country. So,
perfect.
And Amazon, of course. Yeah, that's the last ditch effort, Amazon. But, yeah. And then Glenn and I are talking about a book around Mount Meager, because it tells a really good story about climate risk. I'm sure Glenn talked about the receding glaciers and the increased risk there, and downstream populations.
We kept it incredibly tight, which is very strange for Glenn. So we didn't cover very much of that. We did touch on it, but yeah.
Yeah, well, look for that in the future. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
And now for the last question. You, like every guest, knew it was coming. Tell us your favorite science joke.
Well, to be honest, this is my daughter's favorite science joke. So she's 17, she's turning 17 this year. And she's basically a smaller version nature nerd that I am. I'm very proud of her. So this is her joke. What do flat earthers fear the most?
No idea.
Fear itself.
Oh, I should have saved this episode for May the 4th. Oh well. Thanks so much for coming on. And Hopefully we get this figured out and we can make some headway that investment into something that helps both the ecology and people.
Thanks, Jeff. And if any of your listeners have an extra 20 mil sitting around, Glenn and I are easy to find if you're interested in funding. We do tax receipts also through our nonprofit.
Awesome. And we'll put the link to the nonprofit in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
Another show into the books. This is the time where I tell you to subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me a rating, a review, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
In a world so chaotic, so misbehaved, echoes of melodies remind us it's all waves. Colors weave stories painting the sky, swaying to rhythms as the galaxies fly by.